Læsning og regning skal være det primære fokus i den danske folkeskole, har undervisningsminister Christine Antorini bestemt. Børn skal kunne læse godt for at kunne klare sig i samfundet. Det samme fokus er der i de internationale PISA-test. Men der er en gruppe forskere over hele verden, som mener, at skrivning er mindst lige så vigtigt. Vi har inviteret den førende forsker på området, Steve Graham fra State University of Arizona, til at fortælle os lidt om, hvad det handler om. So, Steve Graham, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Why is writing so important?
Well, let's start with thinking about school. One of the things that happens when kids are in school is that teachers ask them to write on tests. And so it's one of the major ways that teachers think about what kids know. And if you don't write well, and you're in a history class, and you have to do an essay for a test, then you're at a disadvantage in terms of getting your ideas down. Another way of thinking about this is that we can use writing as a tool for helping us learn and understand. So if you're in a science experiment, you might write before it, putting down your hypothesis, and then you might revise those hypotheses once you're done with the experiment. And that writing before and after the experiment helps you think about it a little bit. And another way of thinking about this is when you write about what you read, it forces you to concentrate on that reading material, kind of slow down and think about it in a different way. Now, if it was just important for school, it'd probably end right there. But as kids move into college, they're really expected to do three kinds of writing, which are really very demanding. One is they're expected to use writing to analyze and interpret material that they read and discussions that take place in class. That's pretty tough stuff. A second kind of thing is they're expected to persuade others in writing about a particular point of view, and they're also expected to summarize. And then another thing that happens as kids move to the world of work, then writing now has become a gateway into working jobs in industrial countries and also a gateway in terms of advancement. And then kids write all the time now. You know, they're blogging, they're texting, they're tweeting. Most of the social communication that takes place, or a good part of it, now starts to take place in terms of a written form. So it's everywhere at this point. School, college, work, and also in kids' social lives.
And if they write as much as you say in their social life more than we've done before, isn't that enough to teach them how to write properly?
It'd be great if that was the case. You know, one of the things that's really important to realize about writing is just because you write well in one context with one kind of writing doesn't mean that you're going to write well in other contexts as well. So, you know, the kind of writing that I might do with you in terms of a social communication, it's like speaking off the top of my head extemporaneously. But if I'm in a college class and I'm asked to analyze and interpret source documents and then put that in a very formal structure in terms of persuading you about a particular idea, that's a beast of a different color, so to speak. And so we need to learn how to do that. And that makes instruction in writing really critical.
I understand from your research that teachers don't spend that much time on writing. Why is that?
Well, I think one of the reasons for that is that when we ask teachers about how comfortable they feel in terms of teaching writing, we ask that from three ways. One, you know, your college preparation, how well did that prepare you? Second, the school you work in, how much help are you getting in terms of doing this? And three, what are you doing personally to do this? What we find is about 1 out of every 2 teachers say that they're unprepared when all three of those things are together. Now, if you're unprepared, you're not going to put a lot of emphasis on this. A second thing that we find is when we ask people, ask teachers, you know, I'm going to kind of give you an example of this that'll illustrate it with reading. We ask teachers, how many of you like to read? Every hand goes up. Mm-hmm. I mean, rarely doesn't a hand go up. When we ask, how many of you like to write? About 1 in 3 hands go up. At the best, about 1 in 2. And so we have this situation where teachers often don't feel comfortable and they don't particularly like to write. That's not a good recipe for a lot of writing going on in the classroom.
And when I think about writing, I think about spelling and grammar and, well, maybe not the most interesting, for many people, not the most interesting things to learn at school, but still things that you have to do. Is that what your focus is? Is that what teachers should do more?
Well, teachers need to focus on that, but that, if that's all we did, it'd be a huge mistake. And so I think of a very simple way of thinking about what we need to do in terms of writing instruction is that first and foremost, kids need to write. It's kind of like thinking about playing soccer. You know, the fun is when you're in the soccer game. You're kicking the ball, you're out there on the field, you're playing. That's what writing is in the analogy. But we also need to learn the basic fundamental skills to be a good soccer player, because the better we play, the more fun it's going to be on the field. And what that involves are the thinking aspects of writing: planning, evaluating, monitoring, revising. But it also involves those kind of fundamental skills that you mentioned: handwriting, spelling, typing, and sentence construction. We want some of those things, like handwriting, spelling, and typing, to be automatic. We don't want to think about them. We want kids to be facile or fluent in terms of being able to construct sentences. You always have to think about how a sentence is constructed. And clearly want kids to be thinking critically, planning what they're going to write, monitoring whether or not the reader's going to understand it. So there's an awful lot to teach here. And if we just focused in on those basic mechanical skills, no one would be taking the field to play soccer, or very few kids.
Så Steve Graham har analyseret flere hundrede stykker forskning for at se på, hvordan skrivning kan forbedre læsning. Og han kan faktisk påvise, at skrivning forbedrer læsningen. Han har en masse anbefalinger til, hvad lærerne kan gøre for at forbedre de her ting. So, from your research, what can you see that teachers could do to improve the reading and writing skills of the pupils?
Well, one of the things I think, to go back again, is the basic. We need to look for ways for kids to write in meaningful ways. So if you're a science teacher, you want to have kids write about what they're learning and to use that to analyze the types of things that they're doing in classrooms. If you're a history teacher, you want them to defend particular positions that have taken place in the history. But we want to look for ways integrating writing into the learning of content material. In English classes, or Danish classes, as that would be in the case of Denmark, we want to look for kids to write creatively, but also to use writing as a way of thinking about the literature that they're reading and to analyze it as well. That's kind of a ground level thing of what we need to do. We need to increase how much kids write. The other thing is we need to devote time to teaching those kind of basic thinking processes that go on. We need to show kids how to plan, help them become independent in doing that. We need to help encourage them to revise for substance, not just mechanics. And we need to make sure for younger kids, when they're 6, 7, 8, and 9, that they're not stumbling all over themselves with spelling, handwriting, or typing. We need to help kids automatize those skills to make those fluent and without thought.
So what would be the way to start? Should they write a lot and then don't think about all the mistakes, or should you sort of take it gradually? How should the balance be?
Well, I think that's a really great question that you asked on the balance end. And, sometimes we've approached this at two extremes. All we do on one extreme is we do mechanics. So when I was a young man or young boy, writing instruction, they taught handwriting, spelling, grammar, and you did no writing whatsoever. We've also seen the other extreme where all kids do is write and they get none of the basic skills. So there needs to be a balance between those. And, the balance is going to depend somewhat on the teacher and it's going to depend somewhat on the kid. Another kind of thing that you're asking here, though, is how much kind of feedback and evaluation should go on. And one of the things that happens is when we suggest, at least in the United States, that teachers write more, we often say they need to double how much kids write. We get some pushback. And, what teachers and administrators will say is the teachers don't have time to give feedback on all that writing. And so my response is, well, one, you don't have to give feedback on everything. So if you're writing something about a science experiment, that's for the purposes of learning. You don't really need to give feedback on it. We also have other people in the classroom who can give feedback. When peers give feedback to each other, it's actually really effective. And kids can also evaluate their own writing. So we need to stop kind of thinking about it as it's just the teacher giving that feedback. And I guess the other thing to say here is sometimes we overdo the feedback. Too much feedback can be a bad thing because little kids, you give them 15 things on their paper that are problematic, it's pretty debilitating. So, just a couple at a time would be what I'd suggest.
And how is the way to figure out what good writing is?
Okay. Well, that's a tough question. You know, when you think about this, some people like particular writers. Like, I love Kurt Vonnegut, but I'm not so crazy about Hemingway. And I'm not exactly sure why. I can't pinpoint what it is. But when we think about good writing, we usually think about 6 traits. And one of those traits is your ideas, you know, how well they're developed, how dense and thick they are in terms of the subject matter. Another thing that we think about is how well those ideas are organized. I mean, you can have great ideas, but if they're just a jumble, it's really difficult to understand those. Another thing is the vocabulary you use. You know, what really makes good writing in a lot of ways is if you have the right word to express a thought or an idea. That can be really powerful. Another thing is how the sentences are put together. So you want a sentence that conveys your meaning, and you don't want to have a lot of repetition. So, you know, we vary sentences to meet our purpose in terms of good writing. And still another thing which is really tough to get a handle on is voice. You know, hearing the person, the author inside whatever's written. And then finally is our conventions or mechanics. We'd like not to have a whole lot of errors. Now, those things all together are kind of the attributes of good writing. And when we try to measure it, we do it in one of 2 ways. We ask a person to give a single score on the composition, read it pretty quickly, and they keep all of those things in mind. And then the other way of doing it is they look at a paper and they give a separate score for each one. It ends up the scores are just about the same. So.
And what about the children who do not like to write? Because some children are eager to go and just write and write and write, and some of them don't want to put pen to paper.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. And so I think one of the things is it's important to figure out what the reason is. But for many very young kids, I'd say 2 out of 3 kids that we see that end up having writing problems later on or really dislike writing, mechanics are the killer, so to speak. They struggle with handwriting, they struggle with spelling early on, and they come to dislike writing, and they'll avoid it whenever they can. And it's a really kind of vicious circle, because one of the ways that you develop as a writer is by writing. And so if you're a kid that has trouble with these skills, you tend to pull back and to write as little as possible to avoid the activity, and so it impedes your development. Now, it'd be an easy world for us in the writing field if there was a single issue that was going on, but it's much more multifaceted than that. We also see about 2 out of every 3 kids, and you're probably thinking my math is really lousy, 2 out of every 3 kids here and 2 out of every 3 kids here, but there's an overlapping 1/3 that also have difficulty with the thinking aspects of writing. They're not particularly adept at planning. When they revise, they use a least effort strategy. And so, you know, it's a different kind of thing if you're working with a kid who has problems with both mechanics and the thinking aspect, or one or the other. But in a very simple way, that's one way of thinking about that. And if that's the case, then we know where we need to, in a sense, put our instructional efforts.
And can computers help in any way with these problems?
You know, absolutely. There's a lot of different things that computers do. And if we just thought about kids who struggle for a second, one of the things is that typing for most kids is more fluent and easier, assuming you have some practice, than handwriting is. It's a simpler motor skill. Now, it doesn't make all problems go away, but for some kids who just struggle with that mechanical end of creating the letter, by about 7 years of age, you know, with a little bit of instruction, these kids can type as quickly as they can handwrite, and often it starts to exceed that pretty quickly. Things like a word processor also have spell checkers, which help kids who have spelling difficulties, actually probably help all of us a bit. Grammar checkers, as kids get a little bit older, help with the grammar part. But even more so, we're starting to see kind of an explosion in tools and software for writing. So now we have software for helping kids plan and organize their information. We have a lot of tools now that are starting to come online that give feedback. And sometimes, for something like summary writing, it's actually feedback on the content of what you've written and the quality of your summary. Now that's a whole new world out there, because we haven't had those kind of tools before. And then for kids who have like physical disabilities, we have word prediction programs that make a prediction about the next word. So if it's a word like elephant with a lot of strokes, if elephant comes up, you hit the key and it's right there for you. So there's a lot of different ways that word processing and computers help. Plus it's easy just to revise your text. You don't have to rewrite everything.
But won't it have the result that the pupils get sort of lazy and never really learn how to spell or how to do the grammar correctly?
You know, it's a great question that you're asking, but I always like when a question's like this is that, you know, most adults now in industrialized worlds use word processing for a lot of their writing. And you would never say to them, give it up because it's going to make you lazy, okay? You know, that's actually an advantage here, is that it makes it more efficient and easier to do. If we want kids to learn how to spell, we need to teach that. You know, and actually computer programs can make that happen, help do that in kind of fun and interesting way through game formats. So even, you know, as we say, the word processor, you know, it helps you with the spelling and you might not learn anything about spelling. Well, that's okay, because it helps make the process of writing easier. If we want to teach spelling, we need to teach that directly. It's a tough skill. You don't kind of just learn it by catching it out of the air.
And what about the parents? Can they help in any way?
You know, there's a lot of things that parents can do. And so for very young kids, before they even get to school, kids need to see their parents write. Parents should share their writing with them, you know, in terms of writing something either on the computer or writing something by hand, which is becoming less and less common now. They want their kids to see them do it. They should send notes to their kids. They and their kids should compose letters to grandma or other family members. And so that we get all starting to think about writing in the same way that we think about reading, with parents reading to kids, interacting around books. We want to interact around text. You know, it's really very common for parents to teach things like handwriting before kids ever go to school. You know, they start showing kids how to form letters. So we want to be certain that we show kids efficient ways of doing this. I've seen kids who form a U like this, 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 and this. And, you know, once a motor pattern gets established, it's really difficult to break. And so that's another place in which parents can do stuff. When kids start moving to school, showing an interest in what kids are writing at school, asking kids to share that with you. Now, you know, as they move into high school and middle school, as they're 6th to 9th grade in Denmark, that's probably going to be less common, but if you don't ask, kids aren't likely to share. And then, you know, one of the most important things that I think I can suggest is for parents to ask teachers what they're going to be doing to teach writing this year. There's a need to put a little bit of pressure. Now, I'm a teacher, so I always feel a little uncomfortable about saying this, but there is a need for parents to put some pressure on the school to make writing critical, particularly because of the importance it has in terms of learning to read and also learning content material.
And are there things that they could do wrong? Like, should the parents also correct the text at home, or should they just sort of encourage the creative writing?
Well, you know, I kind of think of what parents do with writing at home as being like a grandparent. You know, often grandparents will say it's not at least my grandmother would say with my daughter, it's not my job to correct. You know, it's my job to have a good time with Leah. And I would say for the most part, the same things in terms of when kids share, be positive about what they've written. Really, you don't need to correct and change it. You might ask leading questions to see if there's something that they might like to do different in it. But I would try to avoid a negative connotation or a negative set of feedback, because nothing will shut kids down more in terms of sharing with you than to be real negative or negative about their writing.
And how does that work with the teachers? I mean, when you talk about teaching strategies, can't you actually kill the creativity and their own voice?
Yeah, you can. And so I think one of the ways of thinking about this when we teach strategies, let's kind of first define what we're talking about. So let's say as a teacher you teach a planning strategy, and let's say it's a pretty straightforward, simple strategy for 6 or 7-year-olds where what I'm going to do is we're going to read through stuff and identify the basic parts of stories. So we'll start with reading. And then we'll come up with a strategy that helps you think about, you know, who your main character is going to be, what they want to do, a couple of things that happen before you start writing, and how you think it might end. And so, that gives some structure to what your composition is going to be. But you can see that, as you start getting older, you don't want to be locked into just that strategy. We want to loosen it up, because otherwise that strategy becomes a box in which you're trapped. And so, one of the things that we might do is, once kids can do that fairly well, and they can do that when they're 7, then what we want to do is not have them plan all of those things in advance, as an example, where they do some of that thinking and planning, or more of it, as they go. Kind of loosens up the structure. We might add other things to this or change the structure completely. But we want to have multiple ways of approaching the same problem, because that's what skilled writers do. They approach writing problems in different ways.
So we can see that it's very important to improve these writing skills. What are your recommendations for the politicians to do in this?
I think one of the things that's really important is that it's really critical for policymakers to have a sense of why this is important. I think one of the things that's happened, and particularly in the U.S., and I see this in other countries that I visit, is that there's this kind of belief that writing is magical, that skilled writers, great writers, are born, not made. And there's also, because of that, this kind of belief that we really don't know how to teach writing. And the fact is, we actually have a lot of different ways that we can help kids become effective. And we have a considerable amount of research that supports that. So that's the first thing. It's important to say to policymakers, we know how to do this. We can help all kids become competent as writers. A second thing is that it's important to realize the benefits of writing. And, the 3 that come most to mind for school is, to help with learning, to help with reading, and to help with communication. And it's also important to realize that the world we live in today is a writing world. And so if we want the kids that leave our schools to be ready for college, to be ready for the world of work, they have to write well. They have to be able to use writing for thinking. They have to be able to use writing for communicating well. Without those skills, they're not going to be successful in white-collar jobs. And so I would say to a policymaker, this is a critical skill. It's as important as reading, which is important in its own right. It's as important as mathematics, and it's becoming increasingly so. And if you let this one slide, it's a difficult skill. People do not learn to do this well on their own.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
På Nationalt Videncenter for Læsning er forskerne i øjeblikket i gang med et projekt, hvor de går ud og kigger på, hvordan man underviser i skrivning i den danske folkeskole. Det kan du høre meget mere om i Læsemagasinet.